Morning. You never really know how many people are going to show up. You know, if there's only like 2 and everything falls apart, only 3 people know about it. If something happens here, I am never going to live this one down. Welcome to Gathering Requirements. Our goal today is to talk about some of the questions that should be asked somewhere along the point to make sure that our SharePoint 2013 implementation is going to be successful. Now, typically, I do a lot of technical presentations. This is the first one that's on the soft skills of life. And while a lot of the information that the person asking the questions may need to have some technical depth, it's not always going to be the case, because a lot of the information we're going to talk about, not only is it documented on TechNet as far as boundaries and limits, so you're going to be able to refresh this information every time it's important. In fact, you should refresh this information every time it's important. My mouse is on the wrong side here. All right, my name is Shannon Bray. I'm a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master for SharePoint, very similar to the Microsoft Certified Master for SharePoint 2010, the new line of certifications coming out for the new 2013 platform. I'm also a Microsoft Certified Trainer, Microsoft Certified Solution Developer, and the list goes on. I'm also the Chief Architect for Planet Technologies based out of Maryland, Germantown, Maryland. And I have one book that's currently out, the PowerShell book. And I'm currently in the process of releasing a second one for Microsoft Press on designing architectures for 2013. So what's our problem space? We're all here because we've probably at least heard of a failed SharePoint implementation. How many people have seen a SharePoint disaster? How many people have been called in to fix those disasters? Now, watch, nobody raise their hand. How many people have actually put out those disasters? One of the things that we're trying to satisfy here is, and just because the implementation doesn't work the way that the client anticipates it, doesn't mean you didn't know what you were doing. It could mean that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. Maybe their expectations were completely different, right? Because if you go off to the Ferrari website, right, that's a SharePoint site, and you look at that and you're going like, wow, yeah, we want some SharePoint. And then they ask you to come in, and they're like, yeah, you got 2 days, right? So you go in there, you throw the disk in, you don't ask any questions. They leave with a team site. They sit down and they're like, what's this? You're like, this is SharePoint, right? And then they're like, this isn't what I wanted. Where's the big car? And, where's all the fancy ladies? Like Ferrari's good for. So we're not just going to ask about the technical requirements, like your SLAs and RPOs and RTOs. We're going to talk about those as well, but there's some softer questions that we're going to get to that you typically may not ask directly, but you kind of want to find out who all the stakeholders are and what the relationships are and what they feel and things like that. How many people have been in a meeting with people who didn't agree, but yet they're both stakeholders? I once had to sit in, I had a governance, right, and there was an email exchange with this particular company. And I was like, well, governance is really important. You want to make sure you have somebody from each team represented and all of this. And it was a law firm, and apparently there's 30, 40 different kinds of law. So there were 30, 40 people around this table. They're all lawyers, and none of them agreed. That was a terrible day. So one of the reasons that I see implementations fail is lack of planning. People just, SharePoint's a web app. How hard can it be, right? The second one is failing to follow the requirements, the minimum requirements. And then, after that, knowing the boundaries of SharePoint. I saw a farm just last month. When the guy was telling me he had performance issues, I'm looking all over the place. I always check SQL first, because we just kind of make sure everything's working. And I went back and said, wait a second, how much RAM you have on this box? Oh, 2 gig. You kidding me? So there are some times that it's just easy numbers to get things working. But that's not always the case. So there's 4 stages, at least in my opinion, of having a successful project. So we discover and refine the requirements. We analyze and prioritize the requirements. We design solutions that meet those requirements, and then we govern the solution, we deliver, we do operation, and we do maintenance to make sure that everything is going to be successful. So our focus today is going to be on the discovering and the refining the requirements. And sometimes this isn't just listening to what somebody says, it's also letting them know that, hey, that's possible, but you may experience this issue or that issue. That's where the technical side of things are going to come from. And while we're not all supposed to know all the technical aspects of SharePoint, the software boundaries and stuff are going to kind of help us there. Case in point, just to kind of throw out an example that people don't typically relate to a boundary issue is least privileges. How many people have always wanted to set up to SharePoint in least privileges or are being given those requirements, right? We want it as secure as possible. SharePoint 2010, didn't always work that well if you configure it with least privileges. It wasn't really designed to work that way. Case in point is how many service applications we have out of the box in 2010. 15, 20, somewhere in there. How many people have been instructed to create a service account for each individual service app? There's a lot of blog posts out there that say to do that. Does anybody know what the problem with that particular one is? If we check the software boundaries for SharePoint on what's supported, you can only have 10 app pools on a given web server. Every time you create an account, right, a separate account for a different service app, that's a whole nother app pool. So if you didn't build any web apps, right, if you just gave every service app its own app pool, you're outside support. So you call your lovely Microsoft folks and say, hey man, stuff is slow. And they're like, wait, you're outside support, I can't help you. Go throw some RAM down or something similar to that. And that particular boundary, by the way, says, that's based off the minimum RAM. But things like that are going to be important to know because as you're gathering these requirements and asking people the appropriate questions, you're going to have somebody there that says, okay, I can do what you're asking me to do, but it's going to cost you X amount of dollars. And you go to a CEO or a CTO or a CFO or anybody like that and say, I can give you exactly what you want, but it's going to cost you $1 million. I guarantee he starts changing what he wants a little bit, right? So in this session, we're going to talk about minimum requirements, and I'm not going to go down the list, right? We know where to find those minimum requirements. They're on TechNet. We're going to kind of talk about a couple of them that are important, primarily the differences between 2010 and 2013, because while there's a lot of bells and whistles out for 2013, and they've done a fantastic job with it, the core architecture of the product is very similar. Which makes me, as an MCM, very happy, right? Because now I don't have to go learn a whole new platform for my recertification. I'm just kind of get to build on what I've learned instead of like 2007 to 2010. That was a massive change, right? So 2010 to 2013, with the service application architecture and a lot of the jobs that run behind are the same. There's no changes there. So we get to kind of add to what we've learned. One of the most important things is planning a successful implementation. Now, that seems kind of silly. Why do you want to plan this? Don't all of our implementations, aren't they supposed to be successful? Well, we'll talk about what I determine what a successful implementation is. And basically, really what we're going to do today is go over a list of questions. Now, on the slides, the questions are going to be abbreviated, right, because they're long. But I do have a PDF that's going to go over all of this information that will be available either with the slides, and if it's not, shoot me an email, or also be at booth 467 for the rest of the week. So either way, I'll be able to get this file to you. And we'll talk about planning, the governance, information architecture, business processes, security requirements, business intelligence, the role of the Office client, which has changed quite a bit, performance and reliability, and then the most important one that always gets ignored is business continuity management. So, minimum requirements, the ones that are important. You know, when SharePoint 2013 first came out, during the initial beta, the requirements were, well, it's going to be about the same as 2010. And, you know, after some initial testing, they were like, maybe that's not quite the case. Right? There's a couple processes in there that get a little hungry. Search, for one. So now our minimum requirements have gone up by about 50%. On a regular web front end, 3-tier farm, it is 12 gigs as opposed to 8. Now, these are the minimum requirements, right? So if we throw in 12 and things aren't working just the way, or we're cheating here, maybe with the app pools or something like that, we're going to take a performance hit. So we're going to want to increase this RAM. Now, we're not going to know exactly what our farms are going to look like after we finish this document. We have a pretty good idea. But to be quite honest with you, you know, the people are saying, oh, well, I have 20,000 people in my organization. This is exactly what my farm's going to look like. Those definitely aren't the right questions, right? Because one of the things that's going to be important is if I have 20,000 people in my organization, only 10 of them may use SharePoint, right? The other ones may be drivers or something like that. And so it's all going to come down to how many people are using SharePoint at the same time. I can support a massive organization off my laptop, you know, if everybody decides to just go check in every hour or so. Planning a successful implementation. Who are the key players involved, right? These are the people that you want to make happy. Now, oftentimes, the people you want to make happy, going back to my lawyer story, right, they'll never be happy. So now you have to start determining who's paying the bill and making sure he's happy, or she. Some of the things that are important to ask, and when you ask these questions, I've found that organizations just become happier with you in general because all of a sudden now you're asking questions that show that you care, right? You're not just asking about how I'm going to build your farm, but, you know, organization, strategic initiatives, and your mission. You know, what is it that you do? I've heard of people who've come out of organizations that they spent a month there building a SharePoint farm, and I was like, wow, what does that company do? And they're like, I have no idea. I don't know what they do. They do SharePoint now. So you know, it's kind of important to understand what they do, because oftentimes, if you have questions, maybe you're not asking the right questions if you don't know what they actually do. Case in point, let's say if we're working for a particular security agency. Let's just say the FBI is using SharePoint. And let's say they want to have all of these police departments be able to use a particular SharePoint site, but they don't want to manage their own credentials, right? They want to use ADFS. So if we don't have that conversation, if we don't ask them what kind of company they are and who they're providing information to and things like that, we may not even think to ask about the ADFS implementation. They may just assume it's going to work that way, which means when you go, ta-da, right, they're going to be upset or disappointed. Why is each stakeholder involved? And I learned this one after the lawyer thing, right, when I was like, what? You know, why is every person in this room? And it's like, well, I represent, you know, this kind of law, or I represent that kind of law. So then I had to kind of redefine who makes up the governance. While they would still mostly all be lawyers, you should have people who are going to maintain the farm, right? You should have somebody who's going to be responsible for the information architecture, maybe somebody from the library sciences, graphic design, your network people, the people who are actually going to own some of the business processes, but not necessarily everybody in the company. But if that's what you want to do, it's just tough to get a consensus the more people you add to the room. The business objectives. What's the vision statement for each of those objectives? Are there any conflicting goals? Oftentimes, there's always conflicting goals, and then you have to start picking, which ones are going to work, or maybe they don't know that they're conflicting goals. Sometimes just by the point of asking, going down a particular way, you're restricting some of the other things that you can do. Case in point, classic and claims in SharePoint. Right? We have, in 2013, we no longer have the classic option through the UI. Right? We can do it through PowerShell. But if you've decided, if somebody made the decision to go ahead and go classic, because that's what they know, they're upgrading, they don't feel like going to the claims, then they're not able to use some of the advanced OAuth capabilities. So it's important to be able to leverage a lot of that information as well. The parameters of a successful project. This is probably the most important question you can ask them. Is pretty much, when I'm all said and done, what do you need to see in order to call this project a success? And get that in a bulleted form. By the way, all of these questions, I do sit down and I fill in all the answers. And sometimes it's, doesn't apply or whatever. And when it's all said and done, I have them sign it, right? Because this is me coming back and getting their stamp of approval on it. And especially this one. What are the bullets that once we complete them, you're going to be happy? This stops scope creep too, by the way, which is probably the #1 killer next to minimum requirements. Somebody changing their mind along the way. Steps to maximize and measure user adoption. I have built some fantastic systems, but the organizations didn't have a training budget. So then I'm like, okay. And then I talked to them 6-7 months later, and they're like, we're surprised. Nobody decided to use it. Well, what did you go ahead and decide to do on the training budget? Oh, well, we were going to do a train-the-trainer, but it never really worked out that way. So the training budget is probably one of the most important things to do inside of a SharePoint implementation, because if people can't find the lunch menu, it's SharePoint's fault, right? It's not the fact that it's not even in SharePoint. So, and then plans for maintenance and monitoring. After I build this awesome farm for you, who is going to monitor it and who is going to maintain it? How are they going to do it? What tools are they going to give them? What training are you going to have? Have all of that down, because if they don't know the answers, then you can start to say, all right, well, you're going to have to start thinking about this. And then this is not even the governance strategy, right? When you tell somebody you need to have a governance board, I don't really know what in their mind they're going to do. These are the rules to me. If you ask my daughter, when she says, can I have a cookie, to her governance would be, Mommy always says no, right? But the governance isn't just about what you can and can't do. They're there to kind of set the path on what they feel to make sure that SharePoint is going the direction that they want it to do. So the most important thing is to define the roles and the responsibilities, know what each person is going to do and when they're going to do it. The policies and standards that should be defined all should be around content, design, security, features. Navigation's a big one because everybody wants a seamless navigation, but they always start building everything in silos. Right, and then you can't find anything. Information architecture is going to come up here in a second, and we'll kind of talk about some ways around that. Composite applications, which is InfoPath, SharePoint Designer, all of those tools that come out. What are your rules and policies around those? Some people now have locked down Designer so much that nobody can really use it, but the reason why they locked it down was because of some of the issues that came out early in 2007 with some of the workflows, right? And then SharePoint Designer could potentially bring down my farm, and then I would get upset. But they fixed a lot of those things along the way. So have you reevaluated a lot of those policies? And then branding, right? Everybody wants it to look good. Everybody wants SharePoint, but they don't want it to look like SharePoint, right? No matter what comes out, you see, the first time you saw 2013, you might have been one of the people that said, wow, that's fantastic. I can put an image behind that thing now, and it can look fabulous. Or you might be one of the people that said, what's going on here? But no matter which way you went, nobody likes to go to market with SharePoint branding. It's got to have something special. Information architecture. Now, here's just some information on the slide here that's important to know as far as the information architecture. This is one of the areas that is kind of important to understand before you put the disk in. What kind of company are they? How are they going to find their information? How many people are going to be using the system? What kind of documents are going to be in it? Because all of these are questions that pertain to how people might find that information. I mean, you've got a couple different kinds of users. You've got the ones that can go click, click, click through the navigation, and you've got the people who are really good at search. Now, we're supposed to cater to both audiences here. And as long as SharePoint is set up correctly, it's fabulous for this. But one of the methodologies that I've recently started going to even more is for the single document library. Right? Because if you have a single document library, does anybody know the maximum number of documents a document library can hold? Tens of millions. So a few, right? So scalability isn't necessarily our issue there as long as we're using folders and index columns and things like that. And if we had one document library, you would always know exactly where this information is. Now, the problem is you have to do your due diligence on your views, right? Use your content types and cite columns and all very proactively and have good governance around all of that. So, ideas like that may benefit organizations like law firms or military, depending on if they may have sorts of documents all over the place, but then you're able to filter them down, sort them, reorganize them based off content types, right? Because it might show up, one document might show up in somebody's view here, but why should they have to go to another site if they're looking for something that's almost the same thing, but just done by a different team? So information architecture is probably one of the biggest things that kill an implementation after some of the physical challenges. People can't find it, and they're confused. Business processes. We always hear about how great the workflow is getting. Now, all you can just use SharePoint Designer does this or does that. We can use InfoPath to grab this information. Everything in SharePoint is seamless integration. But oftentimes, when you sit down and you ask somebody, how many business processes are you going to use in SharePoint, they don't even know what you're talking about. Right, so, all right, let's take a process that you do every day, a vacation request. What are the steps involved? Typically, they have no idea, right? Some of the things that they do every day, they have no idea what the steps are involved in until they actually sit down and start thinking about it. Now, if you don't ask that question, a lot of times somebody will build the workflow for them based off of what one person says, but then the process isn't exactly correct either, so then you're going back and you're redoing workflows. Some of the other things that are important here is who's going to be responsible for defining those processes. This kind of falls under governance a little bit. And then who's responsible for the workflows? Who's going to let us know if they're successful and exactly how are they going to work? And then line of business data. Grabbing an external content from another SQL database or an accounting package or PeopleSoft or something like that, bringing it into SharePoint, and whether or not it's two-way communication or one-way, or we're just going to use it to find search, and all of that's going to be important. And when we take a look at some topologies here in a second, we're going to see how things looked in 2010 versus what they look in 2013, and there's going to be some growth factors there that people really haven't considered, and business processes is going to be the one of them. Security requirements. Who's going to access my site? When, what, why, and how? This can be as simple as we are going to use Active Directory. We don't plan on using Kerberos because it's too complicated to set up. And we're going to just maintain our users. Well, in many organizations, their users may be 10,000. Right? And who wants to maintain all those users? And then you find out that half those people work for another company. Well, why not put that on them? What happens when Betty leaves Contoso, right? And your Fabricam implementation still has her in there. Then she can just log in and do whatever she wants. And if Betty left on good terms, you're okay, right? If Betty left on bad terms, it may not be so okay. So we want to make sure that we're able to put whoever owns those identities on them. Internal and external. Sometimes inside of an organization, you may have rights to do something, and you're still able to access that site at home, but you don't have the same rights. Case in point might be maybe you can print a document inside the organization. Maybe you work with classified data, but you're not allowed to print at home because there's no controls around that. So that's an example that might be there. Authentication is big. And authentication is something that's gone over, not a facelift, but some additions. Right? They took the claims implementation from 2010, and they've added to it with the OAuth capabilities and the server-to-server communications, being able to interact with your mail and your Exchange servers from your SharePoint box and vice versa. Because now you can actually assign tasks outside of SharePoint, check them outside of SharePoint, come into SharePoint, and everything's been taken care of. So the integration between some of these products are seamless. So with Exchange and Link, they all communicate. PII is a big one, right? Personal identifiable information. Nobody wants it in their system, but somebody has to have it. And what are the indications of PII? Everybody has different rules. Your name and your phone number in the phone book, so that's not considered PII. But pictures of you and your job roles and responsibilities and the hours you work and the locations you work may be considered PII. So if they're allowed to be in your system, what do you do to protect your system? Do you use SSL over port 443 to encrypt the traffic between your user and the website? And if you do, is that enough? Do you have to use TDE? Do you have to use IPsec in between the web server and the back end? A lot of times that conversation might bring up the HIPAA compliance. Anybody forced to do HIPAA? All right, most of the time when I'm with an organization, if I don't ask about HIPAA compliance, I don't hear about it until after we go, ta-da, right? And then they're like, well, is it HIPAA compliant? I'm like, you got to be kidding me, right? I can't just hit the HIPAA button. Anybody seen the HIPAA button? So, and with HIPAA, right, it's not SharePoint related, right? It is a technology agnostic set of rules defining how the data needs to sit there, how it needs to get there, and all of that. So now we have to talk about, is SQL Server TDE required? Do we have to use IPsec? Do we have to use SSL? And all of those need to come in play. Oftentimes we might need a lawyer in there for that, just so that we make sure that we're interpreting the rules correctly. Because out of the different HIPAA implementations I've done, every time there's some little bit of differences here. Because really what you're trying to do is survive the audit, right? Somebody comes in and says, yep, this isn't done, or you need to do that. So those are definitely not things that you can do at the end of the project. Ports, gateways, proxies, and load balancers. Right? Everybody closes down every port besides 80 and 443. But then we understand that our service applications run over different ports, and depending on whether they are SSL, they'll run over different ports. So 428, 43, 44, and 45 are all going to be important, and you're not supposed to go shut those down. But there's other ports that are important as well. Antivirus. Are you planning on using antivirus? And if so, are you going to scan the network? Is it only going to be uploaded? Is it only going to be when it's downloaded? Which ones are you going to use? And are they compliant? Right? Because if they're going against the database to do stuff, it's not a supported implementation. And so when you ask these questions, you also need to find out what tool they're using and then ask them if they've talked to a technical representation from that company, not the sales guy. Right? Because the sales guy will say, oh, yeah, we use web services. That's the only thing he knows. So, server hardening. You know, how hard are you going to lock down that implementation? And then, are there any predefined network topologies? I built a farm for an organization. One of the enterprise architects were anti-Microsoft a little bit. There was nothing that Microsoft could give him that would satisfy his requirements. And so then I started asking him, what his rules and stuff were. And I just found out that he didn't really know. Right? He was just on the anti-Microsoft bandwagon. But then once we actually built the topology and tested it that it worked, he still didn't like it. Right? Because he wanted to go have his own little infrastructure. He had to put a whole nother layer of firewalls in there that did absolutely no good. But that's fine, right? Because you're asking the questions beforehand. I'm not changing anything, and I know about all of this before I even put the disk in. Rights management. Who's going to be accessing what? Are they supposed to be doing that? Are there any times associated to those? Do we have to do auditing? What do we do during a threat? Anybody does threat monitoring on their systems? And you got a set of rules that you need to follow if you get hit? Or do you find out like a month later, you're like, oh, somebody was trying to hack our server? So it's kind of important to understand that information as well. Password policies are the big one, because everybody likes to change their password every 30 days. So, Microsoft responded kindly and said, okay, we're just going to put a feature in here that'll change your password whenever you want. Whether or not you like the rule doesn't really matter, because it'll do exactly what you want it to do. Every 30 days, it'll change your password to something that it says. And after it does that, nobody knows the password. So that's fairly secure. But if you're one of those organizations that to do the 30 to 60, 90, you want to know that beforehand. Although 2010, 2013 respond much better, right, than our friend 2007 did. 2007, sometimes it ruined a weekend if somebody was changing passwords and didn't tell anybody. So let's find out about it beforehand. GPO settings are equally as important, and those are sneaky, right, because nobody knows what their GPO settings are. Only the guy who sets it. And this guy, right, he's reading an article somewhere going, oh, that's a good idea. Right? Turns it on. Stuff stops working. He's not reading his emails anymore because he's still, reading his article. And there's no way for us to get around those issues without getting these questions. So, once again, if they're like, well, we don't have GPO settings, you write that down. Can you sign this for me? Right? Because 2 months later, when now you're troubleshooting all this stuff, and they're like, man, you cost us $1 million. And I'm like, well, you said you didn't have any GPO settings, so I believed you. I didn't go check them, right? I don't believe anybody, right? But and then groups in AD versus SharePoint, that's always a big discussion. You know, are we going to do security strictly through AD? And there's some people that's all they want to do. So it's really kind of tough to do the one-offs, but it's easier for them to manage. And when they say for them to manage, what they mean is the AD police, right? Any AD police in here? I know you're here, somebody here. There's a couple, right? And you don't want anybody controlling anything besides you. So, and that's okay. We're designed for that, right? We're not haters. Business intelligence. What kind of reports, charts, dashboards, KPIs, scorecards are we going to use? Now, you know, the bigger your organization, you have somebody who likes this stuff, right? You got a CEO who wants to see the green, the yellow, and the red, right? Because if it's green, he's like, I'm not even coming to the office. I'm gonna go play a little golf. If it's yellow, he wants to have a meeting about having another meeting about what we're going to do to fix it. And if it's red, I'm firing somebody today. You know, I'm going to fire somebody every day until it turns green. So, scorecards are pretty important to people. Excel services, Performance Point, and Visio. How many people don't think that matters in an implementation? Right? These are things you don't want to find about when you go, ta-da, I'm done, right? You're like, well, how's that Excel services work out? You're like, what? What's that supposed to do? Right? Because that can change your entire topology, finding out some of this stuff in the last minute. Roles of the Office client. Office integrates with SharePoint. Fantastic, right? It does some really cool, it did cool things in 2010. Except for Office web apps, you know, when you tried to uninstall it in 2010, it did terrible things. Which is why I was extremely happy once Office web apps gets installed on another server, right? Because I've had a lot of times that something just didn't work right, and then you go read one of those blog posts, and somebody says, oh, just go install Office web apps. And then you're like, sure, why not? You know, they don't just give everybody a blog. So you uninstall it, and then you're like, what? You know, nothing works. So you can't even now install Office web apps. Even if you don't know it's not supposed to be there, you can't anymore. So that's kind of fixed. But that's important to know now. You know, if we need to have the Office integration to people out in the field who may not have the client, that's an important question because now it's a serious architecture change, right? So we'll see exactly what that looks like here in a second. And in business continuity, here's my favorite questions of them all, right? Because I go, all right, what's your SLA? And they're like, I'll have to get back to you on that. What's your RPO and your RTO? The first thing they say is, what's that? And I'm like, okay, that's the standard response, so let me tell you. Your recovery point objective and your recovery time objective. And to basically sum those up is, how much data can you lose and how fast do I have to get it back for you? Oh, and he's like, oh, that's easy. I'm not going to lose any data, right? And if it goes down, you're going to get it right back up. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. So I write it down. I show them a couple diagrams. And I put like big dollar signs on it, right? And then, by the way, that's impossible to achieve because you can still lose in-flight data. But that's beside the point because once he sees all these dollar signs, then he's like, maybe I can lose a little bit of data, right? So it's important to have that. And oddly enough, most people, when you explain it to them that way, they've never even thought about what's acceptable. So, and the questions and the answers to these questions can cost millions of dollars, right? This is oftentimes a phone call back to Microsoft if you have an EA agreement or whatever to find out, can I have a staging farm if it's not hot? How much is that going to cost me? Oh, it might be free. Or it may not be free. Well, what's the difference? You got to haggle, right? So depending on how much somebody loves you. So a lot of that's going to be important. Who's responsible for the backups? Have they tested the backups? Right, you want to know who is going to be in charge of all this before you even build the farm, because what I found out is most of the time they are going to buy a backup tool. There's a couple out there, right, and it just runs. Nobody ever checks it. Nobody ever tests it. They test it once the farm goes down, and they're like, oh, we'll just go get a backup. And then they go in there and they find out that they completely had a misconfiguration and that their farm is completely gone. And the one thing that we all know, right, is once you lose all the databases in your farm, you're pretty much toast. Who is responsible for the DR plan, the disaster recovery? Now, just to be clear, right, we have HA, high availability, DR, disaster recovery. Who's responsible for getting the data once the farm goes down? You want to put him on speed dial, right, and make sure that he has got a plan. Every day, he should come in and test the backup. Every week, he should actually make sure that his backup methodologies are working. And every month, he should, do a full-scale, hey, I'm going to save the day with my plan. Now, I had an argument last week with this guy. He was a VMware guy. I said, okay, well, we want to make sure that we're high available. We want to make sure that nothing goes down. Oh, he goes, we're on an ESX cluster. I'm like, what's that got to do with anything? He goes, well, if the machine goes down, I can have it right back up in 5 minutes. I'm like, all of it? And he's like, yep, 5 minutes. And I'm like, well, that's a great disaster recovery plan. And he's like, no, that's high availability. And I'm like, well, how's that high availability if it goes down? Right? So high availability to me, I could be wrong, but means the system does not go down. Right? This is why we have all of our web servers. This is why we have all of our service applications. We have redundancy. We have redundancy built into the services so that if power goes out or somebody trips over a cable, right, our systems don't go down. So those are two different topics that we need to have. How often is the plan tested? Where are the data centers located? That's an extremely important question because technically, SharePoint does not support geo-clustering. Right now, you're going to hear some terms out there, and you can read TechNet, by the way, and it'll tell you how to do it. So it does support geo-clustering, but it does not support more than a 1 millisecond latency or a 2 millisecond round trip. Right, so you can geo-cluster from this side of the room to that side of the room, and things are going to work great. But if we go and we set something up on the other side of town, we may not be making it. So it's going to be important that if you have a data center in Dallas and you have a data center in Denver, that if something switches over, everything switches over. Right, you can't have a web server in Dallas talking to a SQL server in Denver, you're outside support. It may still work, right? But then if things are slow, you call our friends up at Microsoft and they're going to be like, what? Have you looked at the latency between that? Budget. You can have whatever you want as long as you're willing to pay for it, right? And the more you want, it just gets exponentially more expensive. So it's kind of important to ask that. Now, most people will be like, oh, we have no budget, right? Because then they're scared that you're just going to, take them to school, right? And you're like, well, I'm going to be working 40 hours just on Saturday, So let's take a look at some of the questions and designs here. Oh, and I meant to kind of go over the boundaries. We talked about them a little bit. Can everybody see the software boundaries and limits that pop up, right? I would encourage everybody, or those of you who are part of the farm planning, to convert this guy to an Excel spreadsheet, right, and make a checkbox. Once the farm you want to review this information You want to review this information probably the day you're going to ask all these questions so that they're fresh in your mind. Things change, right? Especially with 2013. They're battle testing it. It's getting ready to go out and really be worked. So some of this might get adjusted. But then at the same time, let's go find the one here. So we've got the size of our content databases. We have, let me look for app pools. 10 per web server, right? So here's the rules around that particular guy. So then after you've built the farm, you can go through and you can make sure that the solution that you're providing is actually supportable. And if it fits within these, then the performance is going to be much better. You can cheat SharePoint because you have hard boundaries and you have soft boundaries, right? Hard boundaries is you have 5 zones for a web application. There is no way to exceed those. A soft boundary is something similar to this. You have 10 app pools on a web server. You can put 11, but what's going to happen is that particular app pool may consume more RAM, start slowing things down, so you're going to end up paying for it somewhere else. In fact, you can build everything on one box, put search, Excel services, Visio services, all of that, right, on a 12 gig box and go, ta-da! And then as soon as people start using it, it's going to drive to a crawl. In fact, as soon as you turn search on, it's probably going to go to a crawl, right, because it's got 5 processes that are constantly working. And it's an expensive resource. All right, so make sure you check out the software boundaries and the minimum requirements. Now, here is a particular farm. It says Contoso. And I know some of the writing on it, it may be small, but this is part of a PDF as well. But that doesn't really matter. It's just trying to show the different types of topologies that you might get based off of the questions that you're asking. Now, this particular one is an ADFS implementation to where the organization has all of its users in one AD, but then their developers may be in a completely different AD. And then they have a staging environment to where because everybody has a staging environment, right? And it looks identical to production 100% of the time. So in this particular environment, right here at the bottom, you're going to see that that's the dev environment. It's definitely downplayed, probably all virtual, probably all on the same blade. And it's no big deal. But the other environments should at least be separated a little bit. Oh, wrong machine. All right. Here is a solution that we ended up doing for Microsoft called us up and said, hey, we got a company we want you to work with. I was like, sweet. And then we found out that they were doing geo-clustering all the way across the country, and they were way outside support. And we were like, oh, this isn't so sweet at all. But basically, this was, a data center in, we'll say, Dallas, right, and the other data center in Denver. And we're just kind of, we're using a DNS switch to move the entire farm from one environment to another. And then we're using, anybody did the always on with SQL Server yet? That's kind of awesome stuff right there. So kind of not cheap, right, with the new licensing model with some of the SQL Server stuff. But it's fantastic as far as high availability, disaster recovery, because here, we've got web roles, we've got our server roles, everything's load balanced. And load balancing is going to be important too, because don't just ask them, do you want your environment load balanced? Because they're going to say yes. Ask them which load balancer are they going to get, right? And they're going to be like, oh, I read great things about the one that comes free, right? That NLB. Works great in my demo environment, and it works great in many organizations. It's very good at what it does, right? But it's no F5, right? So, but the problem with F5s are they're extremely expensive. So know what those budgets are going to be when you're throwing things out there. Because you don't want to come up here and say, oh, yeah, here's your F5. And he's like, well, great. How much does that cost? I don't even know what they cost. But then they get they get that, and they're like, okay, we'll put the F5 in, but now we can't do any training, right? And then the implementation's going to suffer. This is probably the most important picture you're going to see all week. You're like, what? This guy? It's amazing how many people have everything virtualized. And they have, we have 3 or 4 web servers, and we have 3 or 4 service apps, and we have, SQL Server always on. We are cutting edge. We also have it all on the same blade, right? So if we trip, we unplug everything, everything goes down. Anybody do that? Oh, come on. Somebody has everything they own on one blade. For the recording, let it be known that nobody raised their hand. Well, I saw a little twitch, but. So we're having this conversation, and to be truthful, this same conversation that we're having now really applied back into 2010 as well. Here's what a 2010 typical farm would look like. In fact, if you ask me to design a farm without any questions, this is probably what you're going to get unless I felt like you were really going to start using SharePoint a little bit. Because this is your typical layout using database mirroring with load-balanced NLB, and we're going to put search and user profiles probably on the services, and maybe I'll push some of the other services up. We'll do some load testing and move things around accordingly. Now, most organizations that I consider enterprise, I'll typically give them something like this. Primarily because if one of their web servers goes down, they do not want to have a degradation in service. They don't want people to know. So that's what that third one is for. It's actually to support them from performance issues when that. So the other one will work. This one will work really well, right? Because this farm here will support a very large organization. Now, 2013 is a little bit different. You'll see that services one, there's one kind of off on its own. Does anybody know what box that is? Search? Search could be on its own, but I would actually spread that across the other 3. Cache, right? Distributed cache. Now, just for most of you, everybody use PowerShell to build your farms? Hey, you want to see a really good question? Anybody use the farm configuration to build your farms? Let it be known that nobody raised their hand again. Liars. So, when you use PowerShell from 2010, most of those scripts are going to work, right? Search, been revamped, but all the other services, unless they're brand new, right, will build the farm. But if you use that script, it's going to put distributed cache on every single server. Distributed cache is new, right? That's the, and if you read TechNet, it will advise you that distributed cache should be on its own server, and that server, distributed cache can use up to 16 gigs, right? So if you use your old PowerShell scripts, go take a look at all the services and see now that you're running distributed cache on absolutely every server, you're probably going to want to remove that. Now, it doesn't necessarily, without it, then SharePoint works basically the same way as it did in 2010. And without getting into what all the distributed cache stuff does, it does help navigation, authentication, security trimming, and things like that. So it is something that you want to take advantage of. And then this guy, right? Well, earlier I told you how great it was that they moved Office web apps out. But start counting our servers, right? This is This is what I consider kind of a vanilla enterprise farm. And now you're going, 1, 2, 3, 4. Wow, stuff just got expensive. And then you want to kind of make sure they're split into different blades and things like that. So these are kind of the questions that the questions that we're asking are going to define whether or not these kind of things are important. And by the AD and all of that's not even included. But to kind of talk about the importance of some of the authentication questions that I meant to say earlier is, whether or not you're using NTLM versus Kerberos might be able to support the distance between a web server and Active Directory, right? Because if there's a difference there, every time you make a request in NTLM, it goes back to AD. So it's like, hey, how's it going? Yep, I'm still here. Yep, you're still authenticated. So that's what NTLM gets for you. So as you can imagine, if everybody in this room is jumping on the same website, right, and you're clicking pages, now AD is working a little bit, going all over. With Kerberos, on the other hand, you get your 5-minute ticket by default, right, and it says, okay, I'm good for 5 minutes. So it drastically reduces the amount of network traffic. So that's why some of those other questions are important. And there's some people that, A, can't use NTLM, and B, they have rules against Kerberos. Now, I've asked people why. I've never heard good reasons for those, so I'm not going to bring those up. I was like, really? That seems like kind of a... But there might be people who have legitimate claims on many of those. All right, let's kick back to the deck here real quick. Performance and reliability, and this is kind of our last bullet point before wrapping up here. One of the interview questions I always ask people, when they're, yeah, I heard you work for a great company, I'd like to come on board, and I'm like, all right, let's talk about how to build a farm. What are some of the questions that you ask, right? And sometimes I only hear like 2. And it's how many people in your organization, and do you want network load balancing? So I was like, all right, fair enough, right? And kind of rehash what I said earlier. You can have 500,000 people work for your organization, but only 20 of them are using SharePoint. So the number of people in your company has no bearing on the kind of farm you build. It's concurrent users. So then I tell them, okay, it's about concurrent users. I understand the confusion there. And they're like, cool. And I'm like, all right, so now tell me, what does concurrent mean? Right? And there, by the way, there are a lot of people who say, oh, it's about the number of concurrent users you have. And I'm like, you're right. What's concurrent? And they're like, I don't know. How many people are on the computer at the same time? And I'm like, yeah, but what's the time span? So just kind of make sure we're all on the same page on that, because it's an important concept here. A concurrent user is the number of users that are on within a given minute, defined by Microsoft. So when you ask that question, you want to know how many people hit a particular implementation within 1 minute. And that's what you want to build your farms towards. Growth and adoption, right? Where do you plan on going in 3 years? I used to say 5 years, but right, Microsoft's on a 3-year cycle, and I'm trying to get you upgraded every 2.5 years or so. So typically, though, the answer to that is, oh yeah, we're going to have massive growth, right? But no training budget. So, but it's still important to record that. Performance metrics. What are we going to take a look at to know whether or not the system is working? What kind of tools are we going to use? Are we going to use System Center? Who's going to monitor that? I have a massive checklist of performance rules that I kind of go through every day, every week, every month, just to kind of make sure things are working. So who's going to be responsible for those? And, I'm more than able to dial in, every 2 weeks or every month just to kind of do a health check. That big red bar in 2010 that everybody just left there. And now you don't even check it no more, right? Because you just see it there all the time. Now they've dialed it back a little bit. It's pink or so. but it's no longer the big bold red. But who's responsible for taking care of that, and what are they going to do about it? Ignoring it is not a legitimate option. Services. What services do you plan on using? Now, some of the things that are important as far as services are concerned is, right, we all know about user profile sync, right? Which, if we have hundreds of thousands of users, we want to use profile sync. We don't want to manually enter all those folks. But audiences are really important to people. And so audiences are all tied to the user profiles. So a lot of people forget to ask whether or not there's any sort of audience targeting inside the environment. And without that, sometimes user profiles doesn't even get built. So it's important, or somebody just builds every service out. That's kind of one thing that I would want to discourage people from. Only put the services out that you've gathered the requirements for. Geographical areas we've kind of talked about a little bit. AD, SharePoint, SQL locations. Right, we have a 1 millisecond latency or 2 round trip that we have to stay under for support. So we want to make sure that these boxes are either physically close or at least within a proximity to get those values. What are your peak hours? If your peak hours at 9 a.m., we want to make sure that we build the system so that it is responding, during your peak hours. Monitoring and maintaining, well, most people don't really do this. It's got its whole little section in Central Admin, and I've kind of found that a lot of people, SharePoint administrators, right, they have other jobs. SharePoint was just kind of dumped on them, right? So they're off doing their real job, or so they say, right? And SharePoint doesn't get the love that it necessarily deserves. And so we kind of want to know that beforehand. If not, maybe you're sitting in some emails and stuff. Hey, how's my farm working? Are you taking care of it? I hate when I build up this great farm and I'm proud, and a year later I come in and I just see that health analyzer just full of just garbage that could have been taken care of. The RAM, distribution, and NUMA boundaries. So the NUMA boundaries, when you start working with virtualization, right, you may want to give a particular server the whole chip. So if you got an 8 gig stick or a 16 gig stick, you don't want to split these up for 3 different servers. You can, it works, but you have a better performance if you dedicate the whole stick there. As you can see, performance and reliability, there's a lot there, because now we're on our second sheet. Network speed. What is your network speed? How much contention do you typically have on it? Do you have any encryption requirements? Because encryption will slow down. When you have SQL Server TDE, it might work for HIPAA, but it's going to slow down our responses a bit. Blade distributions, development and staging, software development life cycles. These are pretty much all the stuff that gets ignored. So as you're going through these lists of questions, in my mind, I've been able to tackle all of the issues that are known to me. And as soon as I run into something new, I go at it to my list of questions, right, to satisfy that. External SharePoint apps, right, that one is specific to 2013. Now with the whole app model, what kind of development cycles are we using? Who's writing the software? How are you going to access it? Where's it going to be hosted? Are we going to be in the cloud? Everything like that comes into play. The time allocated for performance and reliability testing. Typically when it's like, ta-da, all right, now we want to go test it. How many people use Visual Studio or another tool similar to load test your SharePoint environments when it's done? I say very low number of hands, right? And as you might assume, that's a pretty important step, right? Because using tools like that, I can hit the farm with 500 concurrent users doing the same thing and see how the farm is going to respond. If after that, I can start adding more users, and then I'm able to come back and say, hey, Frank, You're going to be good with 500 concurrent users, but if you put 1,000 concurrent users, your farm might choke. And he's like, you know what? I only have 700 people in my company. I'm okay with that. So it's just important to kind of know those questions. So in wrapping up, every Microsoft implementation is going to be different, right? We're not able just to throw out a blanket architecture, but it's getting those questions from the people we're building the farm for and making sure that it's successful. Now, out of all the questions that we look for, and all the ones that you're going to see on the paper, because there's going to be more there, to me, I think the most important one is, what will you consider a successful implementation, right? You get those bullets, you have them sign it, and then that's what you sit there and you strive for. And then once you're able to complete that, then every project you have should be successful. Is there any questions?
Do things get more or less complex if you don't have time?
So the question is, does it get more or less complex if you don't have peak times? Well, to me, I guess it would get less because you're not having to put in the factor. You're no longer adding that extra server for peak times. But with most people, 9 to 5 is probably a constant. Oh, well then for you, it's simple. You just build. Any other questions? Fantastic. Well, oh, wait, got one.
Utilizing TFS for requirements gathering, do you have any suggestions or comments on that? I get more and more interested in that.
I can get some information for you on that. So I'll give you my card. Oh, perfect. All right, guys. Well, thank you for showing up. Yes, sir.